We're Compound Everything, and we like to talk about money and markets and investing. And today we are talking about a hedge fund manager named Robert W. Wilson,
Yes.
who was born in 1926 and who turned 15,000 into
Over 800 million.
in what time frame?
Just over 40 years.
40 years.
Yeah.
So in 40 years, he turned 15,000 into 800 million.
Now here's something actually. He managed to turn that 15,000 into 200 million in about 24 years.
Wow. And
Crazy.
then the 200 to 800 in the next.
In the ensuing
Right.
20 years or whatever it was.
Now, the interesting thing about Robert Wilson for us is that although we got the impression he was kind of a value guy, at least by personality, he wasn't an investor, he was a trader.
He would call himself a long-term trader, I think.
Okay.
And so, well, I don't know if he would call himself that, but that's kind of what he was.
Right. He's passed away.
He passed away, actually tragically. We'll get to that in a bit. But he is a guy that was actually hard to find anything on. And funny enough, there was actually an interview that you found. And who was on that interview panel?
It wasn't a panel, but it was a interview in, I think, the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, there was 3 guests.
Yeah.
They were all interviewed separately. I think they were interviewed at their home, so it wasn't a panel.
Oh, I see. Okay.
The first one was
I
John.
assumed it was a panel.
Yeah, no, it was a show, and in that show they did 3 interviews in one show. It was John Templeton, Warren Buffett, and Robert Wilson. So
that's huge company.
That's huge company, and yet no one's heard of him. I hadn't heard of him until you introduced me to him.
Right. And how did we find out about him? Through a book. So this is the book. So this is all we could find on Robert Wilson and some scattered things on the internet. Mm-hmm. It's a book by Romer McPhee called Killing the Market, Legendary Investor Robert W. Wilson. So if you're interested in it, I think it's on Amazon.
So I tried to find some extra information outside that book through news articles and Wikipedia, love it or hate it for accuracy. I found that one interview took me a little bit of time.
Yep.
And between that, we've kind of come up with a little bit of our own takes and takeaways from Robert Wilson as an investor.
Yeah, it was fascinating actually. Mm-hmm. We obviously read this book and found other internet sources. Apparently, he wasn't shy in interviews, but that stuff we couldn't find it.
So why don't we talk about who is Robert Wilson just as a person, from what we could extrapolate out of that before we get into what he did as an investor.
What's his background, education, all that stuff. Okay.
So he wanted to be rich.
Yes.
But he didn't want to be super rich. There's a quote by him. He said he wanted to do something that was intellectual and he wanted to be wealthy, but it didn't matter if he was super wealthy.
Oh, interesting.
So, and he was also a man who hated spending money.
Interesting. He's frugal.
He was frugal, which is why I think he had that kind of value investing personality.
I got that sense from him as well.
Yeah, there's a quote by him. I think it was a neighbor who said it, and he said, at one point, Robert Wilson said, "The stupidest thing you can do with money is spend it."
Interesting.
So that just right away took me back to Shelby Davis.
Yeah.
Who lectured his grandson on buying a hot dog.
Right. Well, and the funny thing is, the other reason to think he might have been had a value bent to him is some of the stocks he bought. He didn't like to buy stocks with higher PEs. Mm-hmm. He liked to buy lower PE stocks, the ones that hadn't run up too much. And he bought an apartment. Yes. In the 80s. He had an apartment, I think, overlooked Central Park.
Mm-hmm. He bought it for $300,000.
He bought it for $300,000 in the 80s, and that's a 5,000 some odd square foot apartment on the 16th floor. Mm-hmm. And buying that kind of apartment turned out to be very prescient because it appreciated, I think, something like 80-fold.
Yeah. And here's the thing. He actually redid it. I think it was like a fixer-upper from the sounds of it.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So he did find, again, a value and then made it what he wanted. That being said, there's that quote about spending money being stupid, and he was cheap. According to his neighbors, he was cheap. Because, well, we'll get to that. But what is interesting is he was cheap, but not in everything, because he had quite the art collection.
Oh, okay.
And he enjoyed the opera, and he had a very beautiful home. I was able to actually go through it because there was an article about his home. And so he didn't love to spend money, but I get the impression that he was the type of guy, if he really liked something or if it really added value to his life, he would spend the money. But he was careful on what that meant.
Interesting, because at one point I read about him taking a 6-month kind of world tour. Mm-hmm. He actually toured the world for like six months. And so apparently he played hard, but also vacationed hard.
Yes.
So he was quite an interesting person. What was his education? So his education was, he had an economics degree, and then I think he got a master's in economics as well. Then he actually ended up going to law school and then didn't finish. Started law school, finished 2 years and quit. and decided to go into finance. And so he worked, I guess, for a couple of different brokerage houses, and then ended up doing a brief stint in the military, and then back to the brokerage houses. And I think in the 1960s... I
think he actually went to war.
He did go to war.
It wasn't that he went into the military because he was
doing
a career path. He actually got deployed.
Yeah, he got deployed for 2 years.
Yes, in the
1950s,
mm-hmm.
yeah. And so he went back, worked at the brokerage houses again, and eventually he ended up starting his own firm called, I believe it's called Wilson and Associates. Yeah. And the reason that happened is because he liked leverage a lot.
Oh, yeah.
And so that's one thing to notice about Robert Wilson is the book describes him almost like running meth labs. And so the thing with meth labs, not that I know really anything about running meth labs, but the thing about meth labs is you take a product that's relatively inexpensive and you turn it into a product that's more expensive. Mm-hmm. But when you're doing that, there's quite a risk that is going to blow up in your face. Apparently, meth labs catch on fire.
Oh, dangerous. Okay.
And they explode. So apparently, Robert Wilson was running many meth labs all at once with his stock portfolio positions. And so the brokerage house he worked for at one point basically told him, like, we don't want you using this much leverage. We think it's risky. So he said, fine, I'm going to go off on my own. And the funny thing is with that, it actually starts with a background of him starting with about $20,000 back in the early to mid 50s. He had about a nest egg of about $20,000. He invested all his money into two stocks. One was IBM and another one was called Houston Lighting.
And this was kind of his start to his...
This was his start to his own investing, his own money.
He was trying to figure out his style. And this was kind of a very pivotal moment.
It was a formative moment for him, I think. So he had this money. He invested long positions in these two stocks. So he bought the two stocks, these two companies. And what ended up happening, actually, he bought on leverage, like 4-to-1. So he had $20,000, but he leveraged that 4-to-1. So he ended up with about $80,000 worth of stock. What ended up happening is there was a market correction, but he got wiped out.
Oh, no.
His brokerage basically sold out his positions, closed out his positions. But shortly thereafter, after they did that, his stock positions rallied like crazy. And he would have made, that much money and then some to cover his losses. So what he discovered from that is that it wasn't so bad to borrow money, but he needed to be hedged. And so that was the foundation of his philosophy. He likes stocks that...
So he was long on both.
He was long on both of those stocks. But the problem was he didn't have a hedge.
Oh, no, okay.
And so that formed his philosophy as, wait a minute, I can use a lot of leverage, but I need to be hedged.
Right.
So what he ended up doing eventually, a lot of his stock picks would be stock picks that were combined long, and he'd also go short.
Right. And he had a lot of short positions out at
He had
a
lot of short
and a lot
positions.
Of long positions.
Yeah. So he was a guy who would hold, according to this book and other sources, as much as 150, 200 positions at one time. So if that book calls it, he was running about 200 meth lab experiments at once.
And that was important to know because if one blew up, like what happened to him prior.
Right, then it wasn't a catastrophe.
Right. I love that he was so diversified and that there's so many different wonderful and fantastic investors who have such different approaches.
Yeah.
Because he was a trader.
Yeah.
He was a hedge fund manager, so he was long short.
Yeah.
He had many different positions.
Many positions.
Did extremely well.
Yeah.
And last week we talked about Walter Schloss, who was anti-leverage.
Yes.
Right? And he also had a lot of positions,
Yep.
but he also did well. And then, you have people like Warren Buffett, who have
very concentrated.
Right. He's not as concentrated as he's grown. Maybe Mohnish Pabrai. Very concentrated, according to the funds that we can get access to. So it's nice to see that there are so many different types of investors, and they all do very well.
Yeah. And each of those styles can work.
Yes.
And so I think with Robert Wilson, going back, I think he was kind of a value investor at heart because he would go long positions that he thought were relatively undervalued and he'd short positions that he thought were overvalued. And so that was kind of his hedging position. So if the market turned against him on the long side, then at least his shorts would appreciate. Right. And so that was his philosophy, is that it wasn't wrong to necessarily use leverage, but that it needed to be hedged.
Yeah. Now, because we've been discussing Robert Wilson and leverage, and I know Shelby loved leverage as well. And then there's a lot of guys who hate leverage. And you and I are very careful on leverage. Yeah. We use very little margin, if we use margin at all.
Yeah.
And whatnot. But we have learned in the past that there have been times that we should have been more aggressive,
right.
and we weren't, and that worked against us.
Yeah.
But sometimes I feel like with these guys who use a lot of leverage, and then you're starting to think like, oh, should I be using a lot of leverage? Because it really does juice up
it juices your returns.
And you can see that between Schloss and Wilson, because they had a similar amount of time.
Yeah.
And Wilson just compounded at a rate that blew Schloss out of the water.
Yeah.
And it's not that Walter Schloss was doing poorly.
Yeah.
But I sometimes wonder with leverage if there's a survivorship bias there. How many people do we not see blow up their accounts?
Oh, I think there's quite a few.
Yeah.
I mean, it probably ends poorly for more people than it ends well for.
I would think so,
using
right?
leverage.
And you just hear those horrific stories about people killing themselves. And
Yeah.
I mean, and eventually Robert Wilson did.
Robert Wilson did.
Not because of trading.
No, not because
like
of trading.
Jesse Livermore, who was
That's
literally linked to
Yeah.
his job. But.
So I think the point on leverage you're making is there are successful people who use it, but you have to be very careful. And I'm always reminded of the quote by Peter Lynch, where he's talking about companies, but he said companies that don't borrow money can't go bankrupt.
Yep.
Right? So I mean, same thing with traders. It juices your returns on the upside, but it can crush your portfolio on the downside.
Really
and that actually happened to Robert Wilson with one position that blew up on him.
So what's interesting is going back to leverage. The other thing that leverage does is really adds a certain amount of stress to your life.
Yeah.
And Robert Wilson addresses that.
Yes.
And he said, I think someone said talking to him about his positions in leverage, and he pretty much said, oh, it's okay because I like stress.
Right.
So he admitted that it was very stressful to have all that leverage, but it didn't bother him because he almost seemed to thrive on the excitement.
He would thrive on it, and I think, or at the very least, he was indifferent. Like a lot of times, it seemed like positions didn't bother him either way.
Yes,
they're kind of up or down. So I think from that standpoint, he was probably very cool, and so he didn't lose his composure when stocks and positions turned against him. So I think from that standpoint, he was a guy who could do it. So if you can't handle that kind of stress, then you shouldn't be using leverage.
Yeah.
Period.
Yeah. Now, in the interview that I watched, he mentioned that he loved to live on Wall Street. And he mentioned that he lived in a condo overlooking Central Park. And he references other guys, or I think the interviewer said John Templeton moved away from Wall Street because he hated it more, and Buffett stayed in Omaha.
Yeah.
And you choose to stay on Wall Street. And we know even more recent, Guy Spear has been asked, and he moved to
away.
Zurich for many of the same reasons as Templeton and Buffett. And one thing that caught my attention is his answer was, I thought he was going to say something like he liked the city or he just loved the busyness of it.
Sure.
But his answer surprised me. And his answer was that he was not an original thinker.
Yes.
And so therefore he had to stay around people who were thinking for him, essentially,
right,
is what he said. And he said, Warren Buffett and John Templeton are both original thinkers. And he said, I am not an original thinker. He said, I pretty much sit at my office waiting for my brokerage to call me and tell me what stocks to look at.
Interesting.
That was not the answer I thought he was going to give.
No, not at all, especially for someone who had returns that are essentially about 30% compounded annually. That's unreal.
Yes.
So for someone like that to say that they need help and they basically use other people's ideas, just to me was mind-blowing.
Yeah, it was not the answer. When I was watching, I was like, oh, that is not the answer that I expected.
Not at all.
It reminded me a lot of a quote that you always say by Charles Spurgeon,
which is basically, he says, people who don't use the thoughts of other people's brains prove they have none of their own.
Right.
You need to read and you need to use other people's thoughts in order to enhance your own.
Right.
So there's also the quote by Einstein, which is fairly well known, which says, if I've seen farther than others, it's because I've stood on the shoulders of giants.
Yes.
And so in that standpoint, it's not, I often think as an investor, I have to come up with my own ideas. I have to, go somewhere and find something that no one else has seen yet. But that's not true.
Yeah.
Right?
And often your own ideas, if you do come up with something original, you got to step back and be like, is this a good idea?
Right.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm wrong.
Maybe I'm
why has no one else seen this?
Right. Am I so smart that I have really come up with something special?
And I mean, there are people like that who are that smart. So Warren Buffett.
It's not me.
Right. Me neither. Warren Buffett, John Templeton, obviously. So these people obviously have some original ideas and they've worked out well for them.
Yeah.
But a lot of our best ideas have actually been ones where we've coattailed people into it.
100%.
So I think from that standpoint, it makes sense to, if you're looking for ideas, it doesn't have to necessarily be your own.
Another thing, just circling back to stress, I think in the book, correct me if I'm wrong, there's a point where this might be with the IBM, where he loses all his money, where he's lying on his wife's lap crying.
That was that point, yes.
Yeah. And I just thought, man, like, the market really does play with your emotions.
Yeah.
And it really is an intense situation when you are dealing with money. And
yeah.
I think it says he was lying on his wife's lap sobbing because he had pretty much blown up his entire account.
I think their entire life savings.
Their life savings.
He wasn't shorting yet, but he was using significant leverage at that point. So it's that experience actually that made him realize if he was short, he wouldn't have blown up.
And you sometimes...
So he would have been hedged.
Right. So you hear about these like really big stories and like I have to say, I guess we've been pretty blessed that I've never experienced that.
A blow up.
That serious grief of you like losing that much money. But I guess when you go through something like that, it really might change your perspective on your strategy.
Oh, no question. And
right?
he realized at that point that, you know what, I need a hedge.
Right.
And so that's what he did from then on. And it worked out spectacularly for him.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. So there was a time, so that was one of his biggest mistakes, I guess you would say. But he was also known as having the most, at his time, modern, I think it was in the 70s, and they said he had the biggest catastrophic short turn against him. Yeah. So can you just fill us in on what that catastrophic short position was?
So he was short selling a company called Resorts International. So what they were doing was building casinos, I guess, in Atlantic City, is my understanding. And so his thought was, there's no way this is going to work out. And the underlying company itself, previous to building this casino and these casinos, they weren't doing all that well. And so he thought, well, this is just going to be a disaster. In part because he thought the weather wasn't as good, so he didn't think a casino would thrive in Atlantic City.
He was really bearish about the casinos going there.
Yeah, he didn't think it was going to be allowed by the government. And then he didn't think the weather was going to hold, like not the whole weather hold up, but he didn't think the weather was as good there as it was in Las Vegas. So he wouldn't draw crowds, wouldn't draw tourists and that kind of thing. But what he didn't factor in there's a large population, and the largest casinos were 2,000 miles away in Las Vegas. So essentially they had a monopoly granted them. And apparently the lines to get into these places were insane. So he began shorting the stock, I think somewhere in the realm of $16.
$15.
$15, yeah. And he shorted it to about $20 or something like that. And eventually that stock ran to about $180. And that's where he closed out his position. So he had a loss to his portfolio, I think, of somewhere in the realm of 40%.
That is crazy.
Yeah, just from that one short position. Now he did, in that same year actually, funny enough, he had gained several $1 million on his long side. So it did kind of balance out not balance, but it did kind of temper that loss a little bit. And he lost in the grand total of about 30% of his portfolio in that year.
Now, I had read, when I was reading about that, was a little bit of a short squeeze too.
Oh, okay, that's interesting.
It wasn't only that it had been doing so well, it had been, but there was a little bit of a short squeeze going on.
That makes sense. Now, what's a short squeeze?
So a short squeeze just means there's a lot of people shorting the stock, and then the stock does better than what the shorts thought it was going to do.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden,
the shorts have to cover.
Of course, you start covering your position, which puts the price up, and then I start covering my position, and
which
then
also makes the price go
poor
up.
Joe Blow over here is down 40%.
Yeah, that's right.
I don't know entirely how accurate that is because, again, the information was few and far between. Yeah. But there was one article that did refer to that as a short squeeze.
Interesting.
So I never looked into that resort short squeeze, but that's what they said, which would make sense if it was 20 and then it went. He closed out at 180.
Yeah, and this all happened, mind you, while he was on a 6-month holiday.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So I guess at one point he was contacted by his brokers who I guess were kind of starting to worry about their own skin, having lended so much money.
Can you imagine? Like now, we'd be able to just, get off the heck. We
Yeah.
could pay for Wi-Fi on the plane.
Oh,
We
easily.
could just open our brokerage and be
Close
like,
it.
oh my gosh,
Yeah.
XYZ stock that we're shorting is way up today. We better close it at,
Yeah.
a 15% loss or whatever. But can you imagine you're on a vacation and your brokerage calls you,
Yeah.
somehow gets a hold of you in the 1970s
Yeah.
to tell you, like, you better cover your position.
Yeah, or at least we're going to put basically a stop-in check so that you
Yeah.
don't lose any more money.
So what I can't figure out is, and maybe he did, but why didn't he have a buy stop on that position? If you're going away for 6 months and you're short on stocks, you would think that, and you're a trader, you're not an investor, you would think that you would. And maybe he did, and maybe that's why his brokerage called him. We'll never
Well,
know.
I think in part because he was so bearish against the stock. The higher it went, the more nonsensical it became to
Right.
him, which ultimately, I mean, he realized his folly at the end of that.
Yeah.
And I mean, unfortunately, the market you could be right in that scenario. He could have been right in that scenario, but with a short position like that, sometimes the market just has more gas than you do in the tank.
And I think he was actually wrong.
Oh, I think he
on that
was. I
position.
think he was wrong as well. Apparently, like I said, that casino did spectacularly well. And I think you had mentioned at one point in an interview he referred to, I don't know if it was that position or whatnot, but he basically said part of what kept him into it was hubris.
Yes. He was asked about that position simply because it was one
It
of
was
the
such
biggest.
a spectacular loss. Yeah.
It was one of they called it the most catastrophic short position of modern time. That's what he was known for.
Wow.
And so of course that's going to get brought up in every interview probably that you have. And he said, when you as an investor, he said he had a really good track record for a little while at that point.
Oh, short selling, like he had the Midas touch, sounds
Yeah.
like.
And he said, as an investor, and he said any investor, including himself, and we touched on this last week, that we all have these biases and we all have these psychological problems and issues that we really need to deal with in the market. And he said that he has found for himself and every investor, when you go through a stretch where you are doing really well, you start to think whether you want to believe it or not, you start to think that if I do this, it's going to do that simply because I did
that.
this.
Interesting.
So he said when he was at that stage, he would buy a stock thinking, well, it's got to go up because I went long.
Right.
And he'd short a stock thinking, well, it's got to go down
because I shorted it.
I shorted it. And he's like, the market always teaches you a lesson in that.
Yeah. Well, like Warren Buffett says, the stock market doesn't know whether you bought a stock or not.
Yeah.
It doesn't care.
But Robert Wilson said you start thinking like the stock market is working with you.
Right.
And he said, of course, that's silly.
Yeah.
But you really start to think like you're untouchable.
Interesting.
Yeah, it was a really great interview. It's very short, but
Yeah.
it was a really good interview. So as we were talking and kind of collecting our thoughts and preparing for this and discussing what I had found and what you had found, we both said that we really got the impression he was a value guy.
Yes.
And I just love that there is like a particularness of a value investor ingrained within their personality.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
And you can almost like, even for people who aren't in the market, like I know people who I'm like, if you invested, you would definitely be a value investor.
Oh, absolutely.
There's just a way of looking at life
Yeah.
and looking at money in particular and how you handle money that works so well. And I always think of that quote by Warren Buffett about it. Some
like an
people,
inoculation.
it's quick. You either get it or you don't.
Yeah.
And it's just ingrained in your personality. Now, there is a kind of a humorous story, and this is what made me really be like, oh, this guy like must be a value guy. So when he always took the subway.
Okay.
He never wanted to drive.
Okay.
This guy, he's worth hundreds of millions of dollars.
Yeah.
And he refused. He'd always take the subway
Take the
because he
subway.
did not want to spend money. Because to him, spending money was the
foolish.
stupidest thing you could do with money.
Sure.
But as he got older and he got less mobile and less able, he started taking a cab. But he was so cheap that he would convince neighbors in the building to take the cab with them.
Oh, no.
And it's not even that he would convince them to take the cab. He insisted they must pay half.
Value investor through and through.
Yeah. And if he would go out for dinner with people and they didn't pay half the bill, he would like insist that they paid half the bill. So it wasn't even
It's just
that-
comical.
He's just kind of frugal. And I thought, oh, sheesh, I really, I hope I'm not like that. Like I want to be a wise steward with my money.
Yeah.
But I also want to be like generous with other people.
Right.
So
yeah, it seems a little bit more than frugal when you're doing things like that.
Yeah, so I don't want that value idea to ever like overtake me where I'm like, I'm worth $800 million, but I'm insisting that my friends like cover their lunch.
Cover part of the cat bill
Yeah.
and stuff. So going back to his investing style, one of the things that struck me about it is he would buy anything. Mm-hmm. It didn't matter. So
like any sector.
Any sector. So he was involved in anything from computers to technology in general to restaurants to, at one point he bought Kmart, so retail. So he would get involved in almost anything, almost any sector. The important thing for him was that the stock had to move. And it didn't matter whether it moved up or down. It just had to be one that was probably going to move. And he was also someone who liked kind of, we'll call it hot sectors or up and coming sectors. So I referred to Kmart just a moment ago, which ultimately now is defunct. But the point being is at the time, apparently this was kind of a new idea. And so Walmart was just starting but wasn't public yet. So the next best thing he could buy was this store called Kmart. And so apparently that just did phenomenally well. Another one of his positions that he bought early on, because the fast food industry was starting to take off, he bought and took a position in Wendy's. Oh. He also took a position in another restaurant called Denny's. So now we laugh now, but at the time, those stocks did spectacularly well for him. Mm-hmm. And so he was a guy that would get involved in almost anything. At one point, he had positions in Compaq, which has now been taken over by HP. Cray Computers was another one that he had a position in. Lockheed Martin, Lockheed at the time. And so he would involve himself in almost any sector.
As long as it was going to move up or down.
Yeah, as long as it was going to move up or down. And of course, he'd short the down and he'd go along the up, the ones that were going to have significant potential on the upside.
So he seems like the type of guy who'd really be into something like NVIDIA right now.
I think so. He probably would have been...
Or at least a few months ago or a year ago.
Probably, he was a guy who could pick up trends early on. So he probably would have been a guy who would have hopped in both feet in NVIDIA, as soon as it started to look like the AI thing was taking off.
Right, or Tesla.
Tesla, as the EV sector started to pick up. He had a nose for sectors that were starting to look like they were going to bloom. And so he would buy, sometimes he wouldn't even buy and this was a comment in the book, he wouldn't buy the leader in the leader in the industry. So he might not have bought Tesla, but he often didn't look for the leader in the sector. He looked for like the second place or third place.
Was there a reason to that?
Yeah, because he thought that the leader was often overpriced. So for instance, he didn't buy into McDonald's because he thought it was over.
But he wouldn't short the leader either?
He wouldn't short the leader either.
Okay, because they would have a chance of going up.
Right.
So that's interesting.
Yeah, so he thought that, according to this book, he thought that the second and third place contenders would probably they'd be underappreciated, and they'd have more room to run.
Okay, that's very
interesting. And so he could get them at a lower multiple and lower valuation.
Right.
And have more to run.
So you told me, as we were fleshing this out, that he is quoted as saying, if you can't study the markets for 18 hours a day, you shouldn't be in the business.
Pretty much.
Do you think that's possibly why he was so good at what you said, sniffing out industries? It's simply just because he had an information edge on
No question.
Yeah,
no question. I think his information was just better than everyone else's. And that's one of the things the book comments, the author comments on as well. He said he was ahead of everybody else because he basically had better information than everyone else, even though all that information was publicly available.
Yes. And that's such a common thread between the great investors is how much time they're willing to spend just studying. Yeah.
And so that knowledge is compounded for him, and he was able to generate, again, phenomenal returns with that.
Just broad reading. In July, I think you were reading the Algonquin Sum Report.
I can't remember if it was a quarterly or an annual.
I can't remember. But as you were reading it, you found that Meta had made a deal with them, a partnership, because Meta was going to need a lot of power for their data centers, and they were going to be powered by Algonquin. Yeah. And we at that point were invested in Meta, and Meta had been beaten down, and a lot of people said, "Oh, no one uses Facebook anymore, and it's a dying company." And Mark Zuckerberg is a terrible CEO because he's never created anything except for Facebook, and on and on and on it goes. Yeah. And you read that, and that was a big part of what gave us confidence in our position.
Because they were investing, and they're investing heavily.
Right, and you don't invest into data center power if
you don't think your company's going anywhere.
Right. And so that broad reading and just that time studying, you are a studier.
Not as much as I'd like.
Not as much as you'd like.
Not 18 hours a day.
You're a natural studier. For me, I have to sit down and really think, like, I'm going to not get distracted and I'm going to really like think on this. But you like to do that. And I think a lot of these guys have that, I can't say for sure, but they seem to have that type of personality where they lean towards that, like, digging really deep into information.
Yeah, I think you're right on that. And I think, well, if you listen to Charlie Munger, he was described as a book with legs.
Yeah.
So, same thing with Ted Wexler and Todd Coombs. I think a lot of these guys they're voracious readers.
And I think they love it.
They do love it, I think, So, and I think at this point, that's what gives them an informational edge, and that's why they do better in the markets.
Yeah.
So his direct quote is, you either work at this business 18 hours a day or you don't work at it. It's like, wow. So
we're thinking, like, should we be in this business?
That begs the question,
first thought
right?
That went through my head.
Right. So you just buy an index fund or something like that, right? So it gets to that point.
And obviously he didn't do 18 hours a day. I mean, that would mean that he wasn't sleeping or eating or doing anything for fun. But we get his point.
But we get his point. The point, I think, is that you need to study hard in order to beat the market. And so that's ultimately one of the things that led him towards closing up his own investment management operation, I guess, is the fact that, when he said, if I'm not going to beat the market for 3 consecutive years, I'm done.
Yeah. And the quote I found said 2, or the source said 2 years.
Yeah.
But same idea. And I think he actually did not beat the S&P for 2 years.
Yeah.
And he closed shop.
And basically what ended up happening then is he took his rather large nest egg and handed it to about, I think, 20 different advisors or hedge fund managers or whatnot. And they managed to take that $200 million and turn it to $800 million, which is
that's crazy.
A handy sum as well.
Yeah. Now, before we kind of get to the end of his life, one name that people had for him was U-Turn. What was it?
Yes, U-Turn Wilson.
U-Turn Wilson.
Thank you. I wanted to comment on that, actually.
Yeah, I know you did. And I chuckled at that because, as I've mentioned many times, I'm not great at pivoting in and out of my positions, but he was a master.
Yes. There'd be positions where he would be short on, and then all of a sudden he would turn long.
Yeah,
just
like
because...
out of nowhere. And just
out
like
of nowhere,
that.
Yeah. And so it didn't matter whether it was... macroeconomics, he would do the same thing. So at one point he was very bearish in the American economy. And then I think sometime in the late 70s, early 80s, he just, on a dime, was like, okay, that's it. I'm bullish now.
Yeah.
And I'm a raging bull. And it worked out very well for him.
Yeah. So I like that U-Turn Wilson.
U-Turn Wilson. I think that also just brings in that temperament of a good investor in that you're willing to reevaluate your position. And I know George Soros is the same way. I've heard it said that he'll be long one day and the next day he's sold it all and gone short, like on the same company, just because something changes. But the point being, I think, is a good investor will take all the information in and they're not afraid to change their mind, either on the long side or the short side or whatever. The other thing, though, on the flip side of that is there's nothing wrong about holding a stock that's appreciated substantially. Right. Just, if the story hasn't changed and it's still appreciating. Yeah. He had stocks that appreciated 1,000%.
Right. He didn't sell out everything.
He didn't sell out of everything. There's positions he had for, decades. Yeah. So I think from that standpoint, selling a stock just because it appreciated is a silly reason to do so. Mm-hmm. Selling a stock or holding a stock after a story has changed is maybe not such a wise idea.
Always reevaluating, and that's where that 18 hours a day comes in. You're always studying your positions. You're always looking in the market.
Now, one thing I find interesting is with so many positions, how is he able to keep on top of all of them?
Yeah.
I don't know.
I don't know either, but it's probably because he would lock himself in his office and just read.
I guess so.
I mean, imagine you weren't a physician.
Right.
How much more you could stay on top of your positions. Right? And he didn't have children.
Right.
Right? So children take up a lot of time too. He didn't have kids. So he had a lot of time to dedicate to that portfolio.
Yeah. I mean, and that was his occupation.
Yeah, and that was his edge. That's why he did so well. Yeah. So one of the quotes I really liked by him was, I want to make it, this isn't an exact quote, but essentially he said, I want to have $1 billion. I might not get there, but the important thing is that I try. And he came so close. He got to 800 million. He was so close.
And I think he probably could have done it.
Yes.
I think if he had just kind of kept going. But I think one of the things that changed is he became a philanthropist.
He did. He was a very generous man.
Yeah. And so I think, to your point, I think the value investing, and you told me a little adage I'm going to ask you to share now, but you gave me a little adage about, some of the charities he was looking into and whatnot, and why he invested in certain charities.
Yes.
And it just kind of gives you, again, that little bit more of a sense that I think this guy's a value investor.
Yeah.
And what was that story?
So he was very generous.
Yeah.
And there's actually another story where he has a little email conversation with Bill Gates about his charity,
you told
which
me
we'll
that
get
was
to.
funny,
but
yeah.
he was a very generous man, and he actually wanted to die having given all his money away.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he got up to giving almost everything away except for the last $100 million, which apparently was tied up in long-term investments, so therefore he couldn't.
Okay.
So he gave to lots of different causes, but one of the causes he gave to was education. And he ended up giving to a religious school, a Catholic school, but he was an atheist. And so someone asked, like, why on earth are you going to donate money to this Catholic school when you yourself are an atheist? And
right.
I mean, obviously education is the number one driver, but the reason he picked this particular school is because he had looked into the public school system. And I think it was somewhere like around $18,000 per kid to get through 1 year of school. So, it costs the city or state or whatever quite a bit of money per head, right? But he found this Catholic school where it was $3,000 to get a student through the year.
Right.
So he thought, well, I can give $10,000. Now, obviously, he gave much more than $10,000, but he used that as his number.
Yeah.
I can give $10,000 to this public school and not even cover one child.
Education.
For a year.
Yeah.
Or I can give $10,000 to this private school, and it's going to cover 3 students for the year. So to him, he's like, it's just economical.
Right.
He said, I want to help as many people as I can. You're helping many more people that way.
Yeah.
Another thing he was really into in charity was matching.
Yes.
He said it was pretty much an infinite money machine. And he really loved to encourage people to give. So he would say, like, I'm going to give to your organization, but I want your organization to match it. And here's the check. But I'm not going to give it to you until you match this.
Right.
Because he was trying to encourage other people to give as well.
Right.
And trying to get whatever charity it was, as much money as they could have. And
right.
So that was kind of a cool...
That's neat. Again, it goes to that value bent, right? I want to get as much value from this as I can.
Yeah, and just encourage people to be great. Now, that being said, he actually got a email from Bill Gates. And him and Bill Gates and Warren Buffett have, I can't remember what it's called, a pledge, a giving pledge? Is that what it's called? Yeah, the giving pledge. And they really wanted Robert Wilson to sign his name on this giving pledge. And it's a very nice email that Bill Gates sent. And it was a very nice email that Robert Wilson sent back saying, yep, no, I'm not into that. I don't understand it. I kind of think it's silly. And he said, you're not even having to give. You could pull out at the last time, and you're just saying you're going to give to a charity, and I really don't want any part of that.
Interesting.
And Bill Gates actually emailed him back.
Okay.
And tried to persuade him and saying, well, this is to encourage other young people to give. Like, we're trying to encourage, we're putting our name down in the charity because we really want to encourage people to be philanthropists, right?
Yeah.
We want to encourage young people. And so he emailed back again. And this time was a little more forceful, saying, like, yep, no, I don't want to be part of it. And I don't understand, like, this isn't, he just thought it was silly. He just didn't understand. And he, when asked about it, he said, he said, what is the point of asking young people to give money because they don't have much to give? Let them just pursue their career and then encourage them to give by watching you actually give, not pledging to give.
Right.
And so he, I think, just kind of gave quietly.
Yeah.
And it was an interesting, I have the emails, I'm not going to read them, but it was quite interesting because that second email that Wilson sent back, he was like, yeah, no, I don't like it.
Yeah.
So at the end of this, he pretty much says to Bill Gates, I want to stay far away from it, and he thought it was worthless.
Oh, wow.
And pretty much like, don't contact me about this again because I'm not interested. Now, you would read through, if you only read through those emails, you would think, wow, what a jerk. Like, he had $800 million, he didn't even want to pledge to give anything.
Yeah.
But he did, in fact, give a lot. He just did it without putting his name on a big billionaire list of people.
Sure.
A little more humble.
Yeah.
And
he seemed like a very humble man and a very practical man.
Yeah. So I think as far as investing goes, that's probably everything we could really find on him. Those are the big, broader stories. There's little things we could talk about, but for sake of time, maybe we'll stop there.
Yep.
And we'll kind of talk about the tragedy that was the end of his life, although I don't think he would call it a tragedy.
He wouldn't call it at all a tragedy.
Definitely tragic.
Yeah. So at the end of his life, he ended up having a stroke. And then I think not long after, he had another second, more serious stroke. And I think that's kind of what did it for him. He was, I guess, just done.
Well, he was left without the ability to do all the things he had done prior to his stroke.
Yeah,
it affected his life.
And I think he was about 87 years old at the time. And I think it was on December 23rd, he wrote a letter to his friends and whoever would find him, and saying his partner, saying, I don't regret what I'm about to do. And he went to his 16th story or 15th story window and proceeded to jump out of it.
Yeah, and then landed in the courtyard.
150 feet below.
Yeah.
And that's how he ended his life.
Yeah.
But basically, it said he said, I don't regret what I'm about to do. Cancel my appointments.
He'll have the list of his appointments to be canceled.
And that was the end of Robert Wilson. And
it's really a tragic end. And, he was escaping a life that in his mind was not worth continuing.
Yeah.
But it's sad anytime someone commits suicide, because they leave people behind.
And they leave people grieving.
And I know his note said he was okay with it and everything, but I'm not sure if anyone's super okay with death.
Yeah. It opens up a whole other can of worms.
It does.
But I think at the end of his life he ended it how he lived, I think, in a kind of a spectacular fashion.
U-turn Wilson. He was alive one minute and he was dead the next.
Yeah, I mean, it just kind of speaks to his kind of eccentricity, I guess, in a sense.
Yeah, it really does. And, it's kind of crazy, too, that he ended up ending his life plunging from a 16-story condo at
87 years old.
Not many 87-year-olds jump, right?
No.
But it's very difficult to find anything about him outside of that story.
Right.
That story dominates the news, but there was this great investor.
A great man and a great investor behind it all.
Who turned $15,000 into $800 million, and there's very little about his investing strategy. And to me, that is just really sad. That's
actually the tragedy, I think, in a sense, is that there's really not a lot that you can find on his investment style.
But you can find a lot on him plunging to his death.
Yeah.
Which kind of shows you the need for the human, we have this need for dramatic stories, right? Because obviously that got a lot of reading time.
I mean, I'm sure if you were to ask him, he'd rather be remembered as a great investor rather than a man who jumped, 15 or 16 stories out of a window. So that in itself is a bit of a tragedy.
Yeah, he is remembered as a great philanthropist.
Yes, and that is a good thing.
There's a lot on that too, but very little on his actual investing strategy.
Which is fascinating.
So is there anything else you'd want to cover on one of the greatest investors we have never heard of?
I think we've said as much as we can.
Yep.
If any of our listeners or watchers have any more information, we'd be more than happy to look into that further, but I think we've covered it.
So thank you for watching. This was a very fun podcast to prepare for. If you can like and subscribe, that really helps our video, and we will see you next week.